Hi, this week in the 7-Minute Word, we're talking about marriage, especially some of the mistakes or failures that we can make in marriage and in romantic relationships. And what we're doing is we're looking at a verse that's repeated in the Bible in 5 different places, and it's really, in some ways, the most significant instruction in the Bible on marriage. There are other principles and things that you can apply, but this is one of the most direct statements that the Bible gives us on marriage. It's in Genesis chapter 2, and then I've read it from Ephesians 5. Here's what it says. It says, "For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh." And today I want to talk about this idea of being united, and the mistake that this really points to is the mistake or the failure, basically, to commit in marriage. And when I say the failure to commit, the reason I choose that word is because to be united in the Greek, which underlies our New Testament, Hebrew underlies our Old Testament, the image is of something glued together. And the Hebrew word for to be united, to cleave, some of the old translations have, is the word debak. And what that word meant was to glue two things together in such a way that if one of them came apart, it took a piece of the other one with it. It would be like two boards being glued together. And then when you pull them apart, you can't just take the old or one piece and the other piece is left intact, but instead you pull a piece of the other with you. And the reason that imagery is significant is because what that imagery really shows us is that the biblical image of marriage, the biblical image of relationship, is that you become so committed that you now become one entity. And so if we look at marriage in a way that our culture tends to look at marriage, what we'll do is we'll say, well, if something's not right in my marriage, what I need is I need a new person. I need a new somebody else. I need, in a sense, to find somebody that I have chemistry with once again, rather than living with a sense of commitment and living with a sense of saying, I have to give of myself fully to this person. I love how Elizabeth Elliot wrote about this years ago. Here's what Elizabeth Elliot said. She said, the fact is, she was writing to women. Elizabeth Elliot was the wife of Jim Elliot, who was killed in Ecuador in the 1950s. She's written several things in the years since. She said this. She said, the fact is, your provider may lose his job. Your knight in shining armor might experience a public defeat. Your husband may make a serious mistake that you warned him about. Your lover may become a helpless patient, sick, sore, sad, needing your presence and care almost every minute of the day and night. This isn't the man I married, you will say, and it will be true. But you married him for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, and those tremendous promises took into account the possibility of radical change. And then Elizabeth Elliot says this. She says, that's exactly why those promises were necessary. Now what she is pointing at, and I think this is so significant, is she's saying that the reality of your vows is that the very reason you make vows, the very reason you make commitment, is because you don't know what the future will hold. And what you're saying is, regardless of what happens, regardless of the mistakes you make, regardless of the things that come into our life, I will be fully committed to you. And here's what happens if you are not committed in a relationship. If you go into a relationship and say, listen, I'll stay with you as long as you do these things, as long as these things are true, then you sabotage that very relationship, because what you're doing is you're threatening the relationship by saying, if you don't change, then I won't be committed. And by threatening the relationship, what you're doing is you're saying, I don't love you regardless. I only love you if you give to me what it is that I want most from you. And the problem with that is any marriage takes at least 2 people to be, not at least 2, it takes 2 in order to be what it can be. And so what will happen is that you will then say to your spouse, in essence, you aren't enough right now. And when you leave and look for somebody else, you'll take all of the stuff that you brought into that marriage with you. And it isn't really just staying in the relationship that I'm talking about. You probably know a lot of people who are in marriages who haven't left physically, but emotionally, spiritually, in terms of their heart, they've left. And what they've done is they've gone somewhere else altogether. They've allowed their interest in recreational activities and their work and their kids in their parents to become primary instead of being committed to the relationship. One of the joys that I have as a pastor is I get to officiate weddings from time to time. And over the course of my years as a pastor, I've officiated several hundred weddings at this point. And it's always an incredible moment when a bride and groom come together in front of all of their friends and family, and they hold hands and they look into each other's eyes and they say these vows, and they usually mean them at that moment. But usually right before that moment, I'll lay it on a little thick for the couple. I'll say, do you realize what you're doing here today? You are committing to your spouse for the rest of your life, to be committed to him alone. For the rest of your life, you're committed to her alone. Nobody else. Doesn't matter what happens. And I'll stand there and say, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah. And they make the commitment with full heart. And then what happens is, a couple years later, there's kids, there's diapers, there's chores, toilets need to be cleaned, garbage needs to be taken out. And they say, if only she would do this, if only he would do this. Instead of saying, I committed to you for better or worse. And you see, the strength for this isn't just in saying, I'll buck up and I'll commit no matter how hard it is. But the strength comes from saying, my marriage, this is what Ephesians 5 says, it says it's a mystery. My marriage is really to be a gospel reenactment. And what that means is I'm committed to you even when you're not committed to me, even when you're faithless. And when you and I bring that kind of commitment to our marriage, when we bring that kind of heart to our marriage, what we do is we bring the love of God into our marriage. And when a spouse feels that, when you feel that, then your commitment, your love, your dedication will grow exponentially.